What was the Tower of Babel? Was it a portal allowing humans access to fallen angels? Now, the Tower of Babel is a very interesting account in the Bible. God himself directly intercedes only a few times in the whole Bible. When Adam and Eve fell into sin, God cast them out of the garden and pronounced the curse. When the Nephilim were created, God himself sent the flood to wipe out the corrupted gene pool. And the third time God himself intervened was the Tower of Babel. But you have to ask yourself why. In the first instance, in regard to the fall, sinful people could no longer exist in the perfection of the garden and walk face to face with God. This all makes sense. You can understand why God would also want to eliminate a corrupted gene pool with the flood. Again, this all makes sense. But why would God want to stop the building of the Tower of Babel? And why did he have to intervene himself? We had humanity seemingly getting along and working on what seemed like a noble project, the building of a city and a tower. Yet God intervened and caused the languages on earth to become confused in order to stop the tower. Something very, very bad was happening that isn't directly obvious in the text in order for God to have intervened personally as he did. Let's see what God has to say about this particular tower. Indeed, the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now, nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Genesis 11:6. This is a very confusing verse to me if you just look at it plainly and don't look at it closely. It seems like something is missing in the explanation. Why is it a problem that nothing will be withheld from mankind? And why is the building of the tower going to allow them to do anything that they want? That's implied. These are very big questions. When God said nothing would be withheld from them, the Hebrew word is bashar, meaning inaccessible. Nothing would be inaccessible to them, to the people, to humans. What wouldn't be inaccessible? It's not stated, but it's implied. Maybe knowledge, maybe forbidden demonic knowledge. That at least is our theory. Look at what the non-canonical book of Jubilees says about this same event. It's almost exactly the same idea and wording as the Bible, but there is a slight difference. See if you find it. For they departed from the land of Ararat eastward to Shinar. For in his days, and that's Peleg's days, they built the city and the tower, saying, Go to, let us ascend thereby into heaven. Jubilees 10:19. Did you catch it? They intended to ascend into heaven, to transcend the veil between earth and heaven. That was their plan. In Genesis, the parallel verse says that the top of the tower would be in the heavens. So this is kind of the same idea, but because the wording of the idea is just a little bit different, and maybe a little bit odd, the idea of transgressing the division between earth and heaven is a lot less clear. But it's the same idea. So let's keep that idea in mind. That they were going to have access to something they weren't meant to have access to. This is the topic of discussion between Dr. Doug Hamp of the Way Congregation in Denver, Colorado, and myself. This is the third video based on his 3-book series, Corrupting the Image, Parts 1, 2, and 3. There are going to be several more, so just keep tuned to this channel so that you can keep an eye out for them because they're all really interesting. So let's join into this conversation and see what Pastor Doug has to say about these ideas about the Tower of Babel and also how they apply to the future, to the end times. You're going to be surprised at the link between this story and Revelation and even Jesus' ministry in the first coming. There are links there too. Well, I think that's a great lead-in to the next question that I have, which is about the Tower of Babel, where all those languages were confused. So prior to God confusing the languages, you could see all those people calling
Satan by Enlil. It makes sense. And what you just described about the confusion of the languages also makes a lot of sense. So, what was Satan's plan in building the Tower of Babel? And
Yeah.
how does this relate to satanic practices even in today's world?
Right. Yeah. Well, so after the flood, he had to pretty much regroup, lick his wounds and kind of figure out what was the next step. He wasn't about to give up. Um, so, God stopped him from his dastardly plan of creating all these Nephilim and all that stuff. So the next best thing is to create some kind of a portal where he can have communication between our side of the veil and his side of the veil. You got to remember, and this is what I talk about in Cryptic Image 2. I talk about the veil between heaven and earth. So before the fall, um, God's domain and our domain were one domain. They were not two. But because of the fall, and because of God is who he is, that he is this fiery electric being, and if you come in contact with him, you burn up, right? It's not a very pleasant experience. So God actually put a force field, if you will, between our two domains for our protection, not for his, so that we would not turn to toast, and we could, still have some relationship, right? Even though where it's kind of, the boy in the bubble type scenario. But eventually that veil is going to come down, and we see that in Revelation. So the angels, the good angels, seem to have no problem coming between this realm, between their realm and our realm. They can do that at will, as far as we can tell. But the fallen angels are limited. They cannot come through without having some type of mechanism to make that happen. And this is where we get into the satanic rituals and all this different stuff to commune with those particular spirits, which I do not recommend. But in the ancient world, at the beginning of all this, he essentially chose Nimrod, who was the rebel, and Nimrod was probably the builder of the tower, right? He was certainly the founder of the city of Babylon. We see that very clearly in Book of Genesis. So this tower, it was known as kind of the stairway to heaven. It was the bridge between heaven and earth. It was the way that you could communicate. So they never thought that they were going to keep
If
building
I
and they were
can
going to.
interrupt right there, I just
Yeah.
want to bring something up. Jesus spoke of a very similar thing with
Mhm.
Jacob's ladder.
Yes.
And he was explaining to his disciples, that someday you'll see the angels ascending and descending on the Son of Man. That's just a very interesting parallel to what you're just talking about. So I just wanted to bring that out for our listeners also.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what Satan is always trying to do is a counterfeit, right? So
Mhm.
the real
Right.
ladder between heaven and earth is the Son of Man. And that's how you have true communication between heaven and earth. But as Satan does what he does, he has a counterfeit. And so the Tower of Babel was supposed to be this, and they even use the word ladder between heaven and earth, right? I mean, it's mind blowing. And even in one text, Enlil says that he is the ladder. Okay. So, or, he's the bridge, or, the way between the two. Um, and I think that was the basic purpose, was to build a tower. And like I was going to say, that they didn't think that they were going to keep building higher and higher. Then they're going to finally, ding, 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 hit the dome or something like that. That's not what they were thinking. They never imagined that they were going to hit the sky and like, oh, we hit it. We got there. Sorry. Like, they never imagined that. They always understood that this was some type of a portal between the two. In fact, the name Babylon, or Babel, this comes from ancient Akkadian, which is Bab El, or Bab Ililu, which is the gateway of the gods. And that's how it was fashioned. It was to be the gateway of the gods. It's in the very name, in the ancient Akkadian text. So, and
Yes,
then
and
when
it
it came
wasn't
into.
until the confusion of the languages that Babel came to mean, um, a confusion of languages, right? So
Right.
it
Yeah.
would be like let's say that happened in New York, then
Yeah.
we'd say, Oh yeah, their languages were New Yorked.
Well, how about Chernobyl, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
right, exactly.
Chernobyl used to be a nice place to live, but ever since the meltdown, Chernobyl has a totally different meaning. And if you say, it's going to go Chernobyl or something like that, then we're like, oh, it's going to get nuked and it's going to get radiated,
Mhm.
and we understand that. So that's where the word went from, the gate of the way of the gods to me actually meaning confusion. It had that latter appellation given to it because of what happened at that place, and that's how it actually became Babel. So at least in the Bible.
Well, not
So
just in the
yeah,
Bible, though, right? Because one of the things I found in your book were the
mhm.
number of um, texts that actually mentioned that same event in these pagan cultures.
Yes, yeah. What I meant was just that it was known as confusion in the Bible, right? But certainly that was the place where everything was confused. And yeah, you're right. What the ancient texts talk about is that somehow the gods got mad, that they were building this tower, and the gods came down in a single night and they changed the one language into many languages,
Mhm.
right? So again, we have that not just in the Bible, but we have it in ancient texts as well. And it begs the question: why would the gods of Babylon be upset that they were building a tower to the gods in Babylon? Well, I don't think the gods were upset at all, but somehow the ancient theologians had to figure out what happened. They're like, wait a second, we were building a tower, we thought it was all good, and turns out it wasn't, right? And so in their own point of view, they tried to interpret it. But the Bible tells us the real story, which is that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was not happy about their tower, and he had to stop something. And this begs the question, because there are times when God himself personally intervenes in human history to stop something from happening, right? We saw it in the time of the flood. Like, something was so bad that God had to step in and say, that's it, I'm pulling the plug on this thing, or I'm putting the plug in and going to flood it, right? As it were. So what was so terrible about building a tower and everybody working together, right? I mean, it sounds like a pretty innocent thing. It actually sounds quite noble. Like, everybody, humanity was of one language. We were working together. We were happy. And then God just ruins the party. Well, I would suggest that Satan's plan was to open this portal so that, he and his crew could somehow come through. I don't know if they could come through physically, but they would be able to have direct communication with mankind on a grand scale, and that would absolutely corrupt mankind to the nth degree. Let's just put it that way. And so that's why God came down and he had to stop the building of this portal, because it was that dangerous. And I think we're going to see those days again in the last days, when Satan's going to be doing pretty similar things. In fact, we know in Revelation chapter 9 that he's, this star that has fallen from earth, or from heaven to earth, is going to have the key to the bottomless pit. He's going to open it up, and really scary stuff
Mhm.
is going to be coming out of there.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. We're going to
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit later because you actually were able to share in your book a picture from ancient Sumer that, or was it Babylon? I can't remember which one, but those guys way back then
Yeah.
that were identical to the creatures described in Revelation 9 with the hair of a woman, and they were horses and they had
Right.
scorpion tails and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. There's actually a picture of that
Yeah.
from those ancient days. So
Right.
we probably don't need to get too deep in that right yet because we're going to get to that a little bit later. But just a teaser for everybody. Those guys actually exist.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's pretty crazy stuff. And when you see it with your own eyes, you're like, wow, right? And yeah, so we can probably talk about that later if you want to, but it's scary stuff, to say the least. So that is what Satan probably was planning on doing. I don't know if he was going to open it back then. It's not entirely clear from the text if he intended to, but I will say that, fast forward to the time of Jesus, right? Jesus takes his disciples basically to the Strip in Las Vegas. And you're like, wait, what are you doing here? Why would you and your righteous disciples be hanging out in this place.
Yeah,
Right? He
you're
takes
talking
them
about
to
Caesarea Philippi, right?
Caesarea Philippi, exactly,
Yeah,
which is at the base of what? Mount
Mount
Hermon.
Hermon.
All right. And that was known as the gates of Hades, or the gates of the underworld. And it was interesting because first century Jewish apocalyptists, they believed that at any moment the gates of the underworld were going to fling open, and these hordes of hellish creatures were going to come out with arrows flying, and they were going to, it was basically be, the end of the world, the apocalypse. So that's what they were thinking was going to happen. And I think they were probably right, that that was Satan's plan, was to open up those gates to unleash this hellish horde on the world. And I think Jesus essentially came and said, no, sorry, not on my watch, right? The gates of Hades will not prevail. They will not open up. And that's been a huge misunderstanding. A lot of times we hear, pastors preaching on this, that, well, gates are a defensive measure. And so, they're going to try to hold themselves up in their city, but we're going to take them down. That's not what it was saying at all. Jesus and the ancient texts were talking about how they were going to open the gates that had been keeping them in at bay. They were keeping them in the prison, if you will, and those are going to open up. And then the creatures from down below are going to come up here. And so there's going to be a huge transfer of different worlds. And so Jesus was stopping that. In my opinion, I think Jesus stopped that when he went to Caesarea Philippi, and he put Satan on notice, and he went to the top of Mount Hermon, and he transfigured and all this stuff. And he was saying, not going to happen.
So this is fascinating stuff. And when we're talking about a Stargate in today's world, a lot of people are probably thinking about CERN and the unusual experiments that are going on there. Is there any relation, do you think, between what Satan was doing then and the CERN type experiments that are taking place now? Is there any possible relation to that in quantum physics?
I think there could be. And I want to hasten to add that I think probably most things that are being done at CERN are being done for just, good scientific investigation. But could some of those findings be used for negative purposes? Well, a lot of things can, right? So again, it's really hard to speculate as to what's going on inside CERN without, I think, having a fair high level of scientific understanding. I do follow some of those things, and I know they found the Higgs boson, and Higgs boson is fascinating. It's just amazing stuff. Basically we live in a sea of Higgs bosons. We live in this field, and then we're kind of the balloon pushing through a sea of water, to use kind of an analogy. So Higgs boson is very, very important, and I'm delighted that scientists were able to discover that.
Right,
But,
because it's God's creation. It explains a little bit more about God's nature.
Right.
But when you think about CERN, when I think about CERN, to me, the fact that they have a statue of the destroyer, Shiva, the destroyer from, and you had talked about not being, as researched into the Indian gods, but Shiva is the destroyer, probably the equivalent of Apollyon. Right. So they essentially have Apollyon statue, whom we know is the one that leads those demons out of the pit in Revelation chapter 9. So they have his statue on display there. Yeah. It kind of implies to me a potential underlying strategy that they have there that may not be obviously, well, we're planning to open up the underworld and bring out these creatures with scorpion tails, but you don't have to worry. These are just scientific experiments, so it to me it has a link there. I think there's a link toward that.
It's very weird that they would put Shiva in front of their facility. Sometimes, it's always hard to know is, correlation and causation, which comes first, right? But there definitely some weird things. I'll say that.
Sort of like the United Nations putting that lion with wings beast
Yeah.
in front of
Yeah.
their, I mean,
Right. Yep.
what are they signaling when they do things like that?
And you know, and that one was just straight up, you know, what's the right word? I just, you know, cuckoo, because that's the ancient griffin. So the ancient griffin is also known as a manticore. And the creature that we were talking about in Revelation chapter 9, if you take a composite image of 9A and 9B, right? So the basically the fifth and the sixth trumpets, and you superimpose them over one another, you come up with a manticore, or what we were talking about on the Kuduru stones from about 1200 BC, which was an image of Nergal. So Nergal was the god of the underworld, right? We've talked about that already, which is basically Satan, or maybe one of his lackeys, but I think it's Satan himself. And so the god of the underworld, and what he looks like is a horse-like body, but it also has eagle talons. He's got eagle's wings. He has, you know, so it's a centaur, right? So it has a man's torso on a horse's body, and it's got two heads, a man's head and a lion's head.
Mhm.
It's got a scorpion tail, and then it also has a serpent head phallus. Like, this is all in one creature. And then there are just different iterations of that creature throughout time. It goes all the way back to the Anzu bird in
Right, right.
ancient Sumerian texts, and the Anzu bird was Enlil. But he was also sometimes Ninurta, right? So it gets a little bit confusing to understand, you know, who's who.
Mm.
But the bottom line is that it was Ninurta, or bottom line is it was Enlil. Excuse me. So you know, so Enlil is this composite image, and in the more ancient texts, we see that he's more lion-like, but with eagle talons and eagle's wings, and he's got venom or poison coming out of his mouth, or acid or something like that.
One of the things that
Yeah.
we mentioned in our video, which I'm a firm believer in, is that we had talked about Ezekiel 28, and we had talked about how that's Satan that's being discussed there, the king of Tyre, and it describes him as a cherub, which of course is one of the cherubim, which have four faces, which are man, lion, bull or ox, and eagle. So
Right.
look at the parts, the composite parts that this creature has. He has those same, you know, we've talked about the bull, you know, that Zeus was a bull, and that and Lil was talked about as a bull at times. And then we also have the lion, the eagle, and man all combined into one creature. It's very interesting that that's the same.
The release of these demonic beings that we just spoke of likely includes the release of the Watchers, who were imprisoned for leaving their abode in heaven and transgressing with human women. What will happen when these Watchers are released? Click right here to keep watching and learn why this will make things a literal hell on earth. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.